My PowerPoint is not going to be too extensive, but hopefully I'm going to be able to offer something to you that you haven't had before. I am at Patrick Henry College, and that is a classical education school. It is not a Missouri Synod school, but we're working on that. We're converting it from within. So, and Jackquelyn is the long name that my parents gave me. Please feel free to call me Jackie if you have any questions or anything like that. Okay, let's begin with a word of prayer. Lord, we ask that you bless all people who have traveled to this conference, that they will be blessed and will receive instruction and encouragement, and that their needs will be met at the various sessions. We also look forward to the opportunity to worship you in our openings and closings, and to remember that all good things come from you, and you are the source of all knowledge. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Well, there's nothing new under the sun. And we know that from Ecclesiastes 1:9. And we experience that in classical education, because to us, classical means orthodox, established, traditional education that has stood, come on in, the test of time. Classical education's roots from the Greeks are reflected in our understanding of liberal education, an education fit for a free citizen, not limited occupational training. You see, I have to avoid the word vocation here, but not limited occupational training for a slave. So we may all be quite familiar with the organizing framework of the trivium for the language arts and the quadrivium for the mathematical arts. As teachers, and just as a show of hands, teachers in the class here? Okay, see, we're all teachers. In a classroom or a homeschool, either way, we organize instruction using grammar, logic or dialectic, and rhetoric as an appropriate and as a successful pedagogical framework and methodology. Not so the majority of this country's classroom teachers and schools. Although principles of classical education lasted centuries, and I really loved listening to Dr. Kopp as he was kind of outlining the history of this. In the last century, American education took a progressive turn. And as a result of progressive education, now students are expected to construct their own knowledge ex nihilo, as it were, out of nothing. Experience is only valued to the extent that the student is involved through his or her own participation. Experiences that occurred to or are shared by other people or passed down are devalued as being inaccurate, biased, agenda-based, and the kindest explanation might be incomplete. So, this pivoting redirection of pedagogy did not occur in a vacuum. A major shift in economic needs and social understanding of community contributed to kind of a snowballing avalanche effect. As the Industrial Revolution model successfully reordered agricultural society and economies, confidence and belief in the scientific method and the scientific knowledge grew. So education felt it needed to recreate itself as well on progressive principles. However, the new scientific designs of education were not without flaws and weaknesses. Stripping pedagogy of historical, validated approaches created very simplistic pedagogical structures that are no more than scientific hypotheses, experiments lacking verification of results in the name of progressive education, sometimes also called constructivism. Now, progressive education has dominated American education since at least the 1950s through its control of the colleges of education or schools of education or departments of education in colleges and universities, and therefore through state teacher certification programs. So how many of us are state certified? You see, I am. So, you know, I think you can understand what I'm talking about. Many calls and demands for educational reforms since the 1960s reflect that the flaws and weaknesses of progressive education have become apparent even to members of the professional education establishment. And this is the background in which Bloom's taxonomy came to be. Another hands up. Who's heard of Bloom's taxonomy? Oh, good. Bloom's taxonomy came to be, or was developed during a time where the background where with faith in the scientific method. If you can imagine that a wheel represents knowledge, basic knowledge. In progressive education, all students have to reinvent the wheel instead of being handed a wheel and then being allowed to go ahead and move forward. Well, ironically, even progressive educators working with their progressive approach are doing the same things as classical education without knowing it. Now, not entirely, of course, but somewhat. They're reinventing the wheel. That's the point I'm trying to make. They have reinvented aspects of classical education without recognizing or possibly being aware at all that these methods existed before. One example of this reinvention is Lev Vygotsky's theory, the zone of proximal development. Zone of proximal development? Okay. Vygotsky stated that a child follows an adult's example and gradually develops the ability to do certain tasks without help. In other words, that a child learns by imitation and practice. This was big news. So, Vygotsky's followers developed this principle into the practice of scaffolding. I think as you've heard of, scaffolding, of breaking instruction into sequential, individual learning tasks that a child is capable of completing and practicing in longer and longer combinations of tasks until the child can perform the entire activity and apply the skills to other assignments. And again, they felt that was a new insight. The practice of scaffolding and of imitating correct models certainly fall within what we know of classical education pedagogy. I mean, that's what we say we start out with. So the reinvention that I want to talk about today is Bloom's taxonomy. During the 1950s, Benjamin Bloom led a group of educational psychologists at the University of Chicago in an analysis of cognitive learning behaviors. It's called Bloom's taxonomy because in the list of the 5 or 6 people, Bloom's name came first alphabetically. So it's known that way. So originally, the results of this study were to be categorized into 3 interrelated and overlapping learning domains. So if you can imagine a Venn diagram with 3 circles. The cognitive being the knowledge domain, the affective being the attitude domain, and the psychomotor being the skills domain. Each domain consists of levels. The cognitive has 6 levels, the affective has 5, and the psychomotor has 6. Now, for those of you who know about Bloom's taxonomy, you may be thinking, wow, I've heard of the cognitive. I haven't heard of these other 2. Well, the other 2 didn't quite take off. They existed, but they're not as well known. They're not emphasized in teacher preparation programs. But in 1956, a handbook known as the Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, the Classification of Educational Goals, was published. And the influence of this work has been tremendous, especially on current American educational practice. Anytime you hear a reference to higher order thinking skills, you can trace that back to Bloom's taxonomy. The cognitive domain, or the knowledge, intellectual activity domain, that taxonomy has become near dogma in American educational colleges of education due to its usefulness. Now, Bloom's taxonomy, Bloom's taxonomy is a system of classification. There has been a revised Bloom's taxonomy in 2001, which turned it into a matrix, but I'm going to concentrate on the original pyramid, and I think you'll see why in a minute. It's traditionally portrayed, sequentially portrayed in a pyramid, because the study, the people who wrote the study believed that each level is dependent upon the level below it. So the lower three levels, knowledge, comprehension, and application, are sometimes referred to as the lower order thinking skills, and then the analysis, synthesis, and evaluation are referred as the HOTS, the higher order thinking skills. The definitions for each level for knowledge is the ability to recall specific facts, key terms, and basic principles. Comprehension is the ability to state ideas in one's own terms and to interpret and extrapolate from a set of data. Application is the ability to apply principles in novel situations. Analysis is the ability to identify assumptions, spot logical errors, and to distinguish facts from values. Synthesis is the ability to combine extant elements into new forms and patterns, i.e. creativity. And evaluation is the ability to judge by internal and external criteria. So, how does Bloom's taxonomy fit with classical education? Well, remember, take a good look at Bloom's taxonomy, and then let's look at classical education. Bloom believed that each level generally depended upon the levels below it, that you could not perform synthesis or evaluation without knowledge, comprehension, application, and analysis. Now, sometimes the skills are blurry, so that you might have analysis before application, or application in the process of analysis, or you might be doing synthesis and evaluation kind of together at the same time. So it's not a absolute hard, rigid division. But in general, for Bloom, Bloom, etc., et al., the cognitive activities occurred in that order. In the same way, classical education believes that you can't function at a logical level without going through grammar. You can't function at a rhetorical level without having gone through logic and without having gone through grammar. So, what I'm presenting to you today is what I'm positing to you today is that the knowledge and comprehension levels of Bloom's taxonomy align to the trivium's grammar level. The application and analysis of Bloom's taxonomy align to the logic or dialectic level, and that the synthesis and evaluation align with rhetoric. Now, I do want to take a step back and make the point that application and synthesis in Bloom's taxonomy have slightly different meanings than they do in a lot of the trivium's explanation. When my husband was proofreading my presentation, he jumped on that right away. So, application in Bloom's taxonomy is a limited, prescriptive definition, such as solving word math problems, whereas application in classical education is more at the rhetoric level, when you are applying knowledge and comprehension and analysis and evaluation to authentic real-life problems. So it's very different meanings for application. And the same thing for synthesis. Synthesis in Bloom's taxonomy is considered one of the higher order thinking skills, putting together disparate components into a new creation. whereas in classical education, synthesis falls in the logic or dialectic level of if A equals B, then and B equals C, etc. It's more at that level. Meanwhile, or anyway, each level of Bloom's taxonomy contributes to the next in a developmental fashion, just as each level in classical education contributes in a developmental fashion. So as a teacher, the parallels between these two frameworks seem very, almost self-evident to me. It's not only the developmental relationship of the cognitive skills, it's not only the horizontal pairing of the skills that correspond, it's also that sequential development of the skills that correspond. The research that went into the development of Bloom's taxonomy actually provides further justification for what so many of us have discovered in classical education. They just don't call it that. So I hope that I've established that Bloom's taxonomy is unintentionally, perhaps, a remodeling of classical education via cognitive skills. So, how does it work? At this point, we need to kind of take a step to the side and think as teachers. We need to think about the instructional planning or the curricular design process. Because the responsibility of educators, whether you're a principal in the school, a teacher in the classroom, or a parent in the homeschool, the responsibility of an educator lies in teaching or in instructing some other individuals to gain new skills, abilities, or knowledge. So to be successful, teachers must prepare or plan the lesson or materials to be learned. And this planning can be affected by many factors. First of all, by the factor of student background preparation and ability. Anyone familiar with John Milton Gregory's The 7 Laws of Teaching? Okay, he's talking about that you have to know your students and know where they are in order to be able to instruct them in the most effective way. So the level of the student background and preparation and ability, that's a definite factor, as is the skill and communication ability of the teacher. They have to fit together. You have to consider the resources that the teacher is using. You may be blessed with many resources, or you may be inventing resources. It always seemed like I was in a situation of needing to invent my resources. The amount of time available for instruction, whether your goal is to, whether you have to finish the unit by the time, a time limit, or whether you finish the unit when the student has mastered it. Kind of two different approaches on that. But most of all, and especially by the desired end of the student learning. So I want us to think about the end of the student learning. Classical education focuses on the telos, the end desired, the learning goal. Well, progressive education also talks about learning goals, and they call them objectives. So for the sake of the rest of my discussion, when I'm talking about learning, student learning outcomes or student learning goals, I'm going to be using the word objectives for that. Now again, it's an essential component of pedagogy to develop your plan to teach so that your students learn your intended objectives. Whether you're the teacher in a classroom or a homeschool, you work with 3 levels of objectives. You work with global objectives, educational objectives, and instructional objectives. Global learning objectives are the complex, multifaceted learning outcomes that require substantial time and instruction to accomplish. So if you think of Robert Littlejohn and Charles Evans' Wisdom and Eloquence, They talk about 12K planning, that you look at what you want the end result, the student to be like, you want the student at the end to do, and then you just plan backwards. Okay, that's a global perspective. So an example of that is all students will learn the history of our country and the dimensions of citizenship, so that they will be prepared for responsible citizenship, further learning, and to contribute to the well-being of their families, communities, and nation. You can do that in a couple of days, right? Yeah. So, global learning objectives are the important end results, but they're very difficult to utilize in daily lessons. They're your vision for at the end. Educational objectives are smaller. They're the breakdowns of the global learning objectives, but they can also still require several years or semesters to achieve. These kinds of objectives contain a student behavior, such as the student will read, the student will interpret, the student will distinguish, and then a content. So musical scores, types of social data, facts and hypotheses, on which the behavior must be performed. Again, although they're more specific than global objectives, they still are too general for day-to-day instruction. So, an educational objective example, the student is able to distinguish facts from hypotheses. That's still not going to help you in the classroom on a day-to-day basis. It is the instructional objective, which is narrowly focused on the lesson plan, which applies to the development of your daily learning activities, exercises, and assessments. So instructional objectives focus teaching and testing on narrow, day-to-day slices of learning. For instance, the student is able to cite 3 causes of the American Civil War. Now, you can do that in a 30-minute lesson. You can have those day-to-day slides. A descriptive image about objectives is that you might consider global objectives to be the whole landscape. The whole landscape. The educational objectives is the forest. And then the instructional objective is the tree. And it takes a lot of trees to make up the forest. And then it takes the forest and other things to make up the landscape. Whew. Warm in here. I see at least 3 classroom benefits from Bloom's taxonomy. First of all, Bloom's taxonomy applies to grammar, logic, and rhetoric level assignments, activities, and performances, all 3 levels of the trivium. Yeah, applies to all 3 levels of the trivium. Secondly, Bloom's taxonomy comes with fantastic lists of verbs that lend themselves well to activities and assessments. Many of these lists are freely available on the internet, and they come in different kinds of formats. They might be verbs, they might be lists of types of assignments, they might be questioning prompts. There's all sorts of stuff, and I have brought some to share a little bit later. Using Bloom's taxonomy is a way to deliberately sequence and increase the rigor of your instruction, to intentionally engage students in activities designed to develop those higher order thinking skills, to lead students from grammar into logical thinking, and from logic into rhetorical thinking. Lauren Anderson, who was a student of Dr. Benjamin Bloom, notes another advantage of Bloom's taxonomy. It applies to all subject matters, and it's appropriate for all grade levels. Okay, so it's very handy, and if you aren't familiar with it and aren't using it, it may be something that will strengthen your instruction. In short, Bloom's taxonomy is very useful for developing instructional objectives, which are the statements we use to express the immediate goal or objective of learning, or object of learning. And those goals, learning goals or objectives, are what are necessary for your lesson planning. Bloom's taxonomy supports your planning, and it aligns your learning activities and assessments with your learning objectives. And it's important that the objectives and the assignments and the assessments are aligned, because without the alignment, your student is going to have gaps in their knowledge. An example of a misalignment is when students practice spelling by spelling out loud at home, but their spelling test at school in the classroom is writing it. See, it's not aligned. They're not practicing the way you're asking them to perform it. Or when students answer brief, factual, knowledge level questions all through a unit, but then they have an essay test. See, they haven't had anything to help them make the jump from just facts to evaluation. Another example of a misalignment is when students complete an assignment, but they get a low grade because they didn't understand the teacher's directions. They didn't know what the teacher wanted. The directions were unclear. So all of those kinds of misalignments can be avoided if you are using Bloom's taxonomy as kind of a checklist. It allows you to pinpoint the level of learning that's going on, to recognize the cognitive processes that the students are exercising, which ones may be needing strengthening that you need to focus on, and to avoid these inconsistencies between the objectives, the activities, and the assessments. So here's a practice example. Let me go back to Bloom's taxonomy. There's nobody here named Mrs. Andrews, right? Okay. Mrs. Andrews has a classroom, and she has assigned the following assignments. So, I'm going to read them to you. Tell me what level of Bloom's taxonomy these assignments are aiming at. Place the events of the story in chronological order. I have trouble hearing, so you may. Well, if we're talking about chronology, obviously they've got to be figuring out the dates. They have to understand them. There may be some manipulation of them. So, it's one of those smart boards. Okay, I won't touch. Knowledge. There has to be some comprehension. I think that there's some analysis going on there, figuring out in chronology, especially if it's not easily stated, such as the first day, the second day, the third day. But so that's one way of using it as you're thinking about an assignment. Here's your second one. Write a new ending to the story. Yeah, that one is going to be way up here. And possibly, that's going to need some evaluation too. So they're going to have to know that story. They need to know who the characters are, the setting, everything that's going on. They're going to have understood it, and then, analyze, okay, I don't want it to be like this, so that's going way up there. Now, do you think it would be wise to have that assignment from the get-go? No, that would make it a little difficult. Choose one of the story's characters as a best friend and justify your choice. Yeah, that's another up there pretty high. They're going to have to, again, understand everything and comprehend everything that they've read in order to identify a character. And not all stories have somebody you want as a best friend, so it could be difficult. And this one should be a easy one. On what date did this story begin? Knowledge. Now, you can Okay, yeah. Do you see how your different types of assignments, though, you can be aiming them, starting with the knowledge and comprehension ones? That's what I'm trying to get across, is that you can deliberately work your assignments from the lower levels that, get them warmed up and then raise them up very intentionally. Patrick Henry College students, pedagogy students who are hopefully going to be future classical education teachers, study Bloom's taxonomy. So I want to share with you some of their insights and comments. One student observed that the trivium provides the bird's eye scope and sequence, while Bloom's taxonomy supplies a doable framework for the microscopic lesson plan. In this way, both become well-rounded in an iron sharpens iron fashion. Bloom's taxonomy helps to fulfill daily objectives in a way that aligns with long-term goals. Another student mentioned the time advantage of Bloom's taxonomy when planning. Bloom's taxonomy makes it much more feasible to keep the end in mind by outlining the entire process by which teacher and student achieve the goal. Accordingly, a teacher is able to apportion time in the classroom appropriately. She is able to concentrate on certain thinking skills in her classroom given the age and stage of her students. Dividing the 6 cognitive levels by the 3 classical stages, all are given greater depth and definition. In fact, Bloom's taxonomy seems to be the trivium's psychological background and suggests the practical application of the trivium. Another PhD student wrote, and this student is already teaching, while I do not think it would be necessary to always utilize each of the levels for every single activity or assignment, and I was grateful she said that so I could, be sure to mention that to you. You don't do an assignment that has all 6 of them every single time. That's just not ridiculous. That would be absurd. Anyway, so while I do not think it would be necessary to utilize each of the levels for every single activity and assignment, it would be helpful for new teachers to develop habits of teaching that aim at both the lower and the higher order thinking skills. For a teacher who thinks that memorization, or who believes that memorization is important, it is easy to foster a learning environment in which the students will have mastery at the knowledge level. That teacher will benefit from trying to incorporate evaluation level activities that require students to make judgments about what they have learned. So in other words, I think she was trying to make the point that as teachers, it's very easy to do all of your teaching down here, but that doesn't create a thinking student, and we want our students to be thinkers. We need to be increasing the rigor of our assignments, of what the students are doing for us. Well, is Bloom's taxonomy such a formidable tool that it rivals or supersedes classical education? I mean, I'm kind of nervy coming in here talking about Bloom's taxonomy at a classical education conference. Well, while Bloom's taxonomy is useful in the context of classical education, it cannot it's not complete as a standalone methodology. It does have its own weaknesses and its own disadvantages. A critic of Bloom's taxonomy is Dr. Michael Booker. He's a professor of philosophy at Jefferson College in Hillsborough, Missouri. He wrote an article called A Roof Without Walls, Benjamin Bloom's Taxonomy and the Misdirection of American Education. He presents a classical critique of Bloom's taxonomy as teachers actually apply it in American classrooms. He contends that the American educational establishment has turned Plato on his head with the help of a dubious approach to teaching developed by Benjamin Bloom. Dr. Booker attributes the inability of American children to compete internationally to a great extent on our reliance on Bloom and expecting critical and advanced thinking from students who have been trained to regard facts and substantive knowledge as unimportant. Now, why would they think that? Where is knowledge on the pyramid? It's at the bottom. It's at the lowest. And that lowest can be interpreted in one sense as foundational and lowest in another. Who wants to come in lowest in a contest? Unless it's golf, you probably, you don't want to in baseball or basketball. So here's his argument. Bloom's taxonomy has become dogma in American colleges and departments of education. It has been co-opted to serve ends, K-12, for which it was not originally intended. And that is true. Benjamin Bloom himself said, I can't believe that the K-12 establishment has taken over the Bloom's taxonomy. When they were doing the research and came out with the study, their goal was to provide higher education with a way to develop really good test questions. So these were for college students, how to develop test questions and assignments for college students. And the K-12 teachers just said, here, give me, this is too good. And I mean, I would almost like to ask the college professors amongst us, who of them has ever heard of Bloom's taxonomy? It's not serving the intended audience. That's one of his points. Related to the second one, because of the divergent ways that educators are trained in America, the impact of Bloom's taxonomy has been greater in the K-12 system than in higher education. His third point is that Bloom's taxonomy has been used to devalue basic skills education and has promoted the higher order thinking skills at the expense of the lower order thinking skills. So in other words, along the line of knowledge, well, you have to be able to think. You can always look up knowledge to think about, but if you can't think, and so he sees that very much as a weakness, as I think classical education sees that very much as a weakness indeed. So shortchanging the basic skills education has resulted in producing students who misunderstand true higher order thinking and who are not equipped for advanced education because they have no knowledge. So, yes?
But isn't that a misuse of Bloom's?
It is a misuse, and his criticism is on how it has been misapplied. He's using that kind of as evidence it's been misapplied, and it has been misapplied. So that, again, is why I would not ever say, use Bloom's taxonomy and it's going to solve all of your teaching problems. No, that's not what I am intending. What I'm trying to say is that when you know what your student needs to learn, and you need to come up with an idea, and you need to plan a lesson for that student, I do think it's useful then. That's where I think it's useful. His evidence for his criticisms is that American students fall progressively behind as they progress through the system compared to international students, many of whom are still in systems that are closely similar to classical education. And it is true that at first grade, our students are comparable in achievement. But at the fourth grade level, they start falling behind. And by the 8th grade level and the 12th grade level, in the international TMSS and PISA and all of those international tests that compare us, our students fall down. Now, there are other factors as well. For instance, the fact that we have mass education versus other countries that only have selected students' education. So, but they do fall behind. His first criticism, again, I had mentioned this, that the taxonomy has been co-opted to serve ends for which it was not originally intended. again, is supported by Benjamin Bloom's admission that the success of the taxonomy has not been in the area for which it was intended. Unexpectedly, it's being used by curriculum planners, administrators, and classroom teachers instead of the university professors. Booker's second criticism, because of the divergent ways that teachers are trained in America, the impact of Bloom's taxonomy is greater on the 12K system, rests upon the lack of uniform, consistent professional standards in teacher preparation programs. Every state has a different set of standards, a different set of criteria. Many of them are similar, but none of them are identical. The National Board Certification Program, is there anyone here National Board certified? Or even looked at it? Or okay. Well, that's not a solution either. It's a bigger problem than just being able to find one set of standards. But Dr. Booker notes that even under the requirements of No Child Left Behind for highly qualified teachers, specific academic training in specialty fields is optional so long as one can pass a standardized test in that area. He goes on to say this is a manifestation of the underlying belief about the nature of thinking skills that says education can be methodology rich and yet content free or content light. And again, that is something classical education feels extremely strongly about, that you have to be content rich. You have to concentrate on knowledge at the beginning. Dr. Booker says Bloom's taxonomy fuels the belief that higher order thinking can exist in isolation from knowledge. So I do enjoy the way Dr. Booker wrote about the prescriptive significance. My paramount concern, the taxonomy has done more than simply give educators 6 boxes into which they may sort their learning objectives and test questions. This is true despite the fact that the handbook originally compared the taxonomy with the Dewey Decimal System, a system that organizes books without evaluating their content. So that's how I would want you to use it, is realizing this can be helpful, but it isn't an answer or a system to solve everything. Okay, so how does Bloom's taxonomy turn Plato on its head? In Book 7 of the Republic, Plato said that real higher order education into what he called the dialectic couldn't start until the student was 30 years old and had mastered conventional wisdom. Well, according to lesson plans that I have found on the internet using Bloom's taxonomy, students in kindergarten are capable of higher order thinking skills. There was a beautiful activity for sorting balls that was higher order thinking. So certainly, classical educators have to understand the weaknesses and limitations of Bloom's taxonomy as a standalone pedagogy. Nonetheless, I think that classical educators can use Bloom's taxonomy in planning curricular units as a means to sequence and align learning activities, assignments, and assessments. In fact, I would go so far as to say that you could use Bloom's taxonomy as a way to explain classical education to people who don't understand classical education. It's like a translation that for outside educators or for other people, if you ever heard of Bloom's taxonomy, well, if you put these two levels together, that would be grammar. It might be a way to help them. So what I would like to do now is share with you some of the materials. I just made some quick copies that are available online. All of these are available online. Now, if you want to spend money, of course, you can buy books that have all of these kinds of things. But I mean, I'm serious. If you were to Google Bloom's taxonomy you'd be astonished at what is available. And again, using this to come up with the ideas of how am I going to teach my students how to do something. Well, on the first page, and we'll just kind of go through looking at them, you're going to see kind of the various skills that each level promotes. So if you're thinking, okay, my third graders really need to practice, kind of just find a skill, seeing patterns, okay? Well, seeing patterns, that's at the analysis level. Okay, so what can I do that would be an analysis activity that could kind of help them to do. So that would be one way of using it. The next page has questions, kind of moved on into how questions for each particular level. So who, what, when, where, and why, how, those are the knowledge questions, obviously. Comprehension, tell me in your own words, what happened in your own words. Application, how is Bloom's taxonomy an example of a system of classification? So you kind of can use that. I kept going because I just found all these neat lists. And I really liked this one.
Yeah, we use this one when we did our lesson plans. We use the verbs.
It's very, having these verbs, okay, you need an assignment at the comprehension level, okay, compare Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet to Shakespeare's Macbeth. I'm not a literature teacher, but, so it just, when you need an assignment or an activity, but again, keep in mind that you want to keep ratcheting it up. So, a teacher who only requires students to list, only requires students to name, is not teaching that student to develop and to strengthen his cognitive abilities or his cognitive skills, because the first time he has a test and he has to do more than list or name, that child is not going to know what to do. So, another one I liked, words, watch out for verbs that are not measurable, words to avoid and phrases to avoid. When we talked about when the directions are unclear and the students don't understand what they're supposed to do. When I was planning activities, I always knew the first year, the second, by the third or fourth time I had used an activity, I worked out all the kinks. But the first time through, I knew there would be somebody who would catch, would not understand what I meant, and I would always be grateful, because then I could rework it so that the next time it would be clearer for everybody, for all the students. It's how I learned how to print on the board, because my G's and my Q's looked the same. And the first student who thought I wrote quest, when I thought I wrote guest, that's how as a teacher you learn. So, phrases to avoid and words to avoid, I thought it was very good. And then we have, again, another list of your basic taxonomy of verbs. And I think I have, several lists of just the basic ones. So again, when you need verbs for your instructional objectives, Bloom's has them for you. The last section are some of the probing questions. And again, when you're trying to come up with, okay, and I seriously believe you could do this at home just with your own children, not in the homeschool environment situation, but just when they have to read a book for school, and they're saying, oh, I can't, this book, it's so hard, or whatever. Just take them through these questions, and as they get a little bit more confident about what they have, what they do know and what they've understood, they might be able to do better. But then definitely, as a teacher, I would use these questions to help the child as they're learning literature or whatever subject it would be teaching. Okay. Well, I think this is about the right time to be closing. Does anyone have any questions or success stories about using balloons?
So if some of the critique is that it wasn't or hasn't been being used for its intended audience, is there anything to be careful of in terms of using it in that, more K through 8 or K through 12 arena?
No.
Or do you not agree with that?
It is true. It's not used
Right.
For its intended audience. And its intended audience is oblivious to it.
Right.
Higher education faculty rarely have any pedagogical training, as we all know, who have sat through many of those courses. It's just one of those serendipitous kind of, wow, isn't it amazing that they came up with this, and they thought it was for this, but it actually turned out to be fantastic for this. So, to me, that's interesting, but not necessarily a strike against it. And again, I'm not saying take this and rewrite your entire curriculum based on, no. But when you get stumped and you're going, oh, I can't, see, we've already done lists, we've already done recitation, now what else can we do? Here we go. This can just spark your own imagination about what would your students find just a little variation, a little bit more interesting. So, I mean, I could have almost easily done the same thing with, as I say, John Milton Gregory's book, The 7 Laws of Teaching, which I think are remarkable, but kind of predate classical education, only for the reason that back then it all was classical education. So those 7 laws are very much supportive of classical education. Okay, you had a question.
Do you think that the application of Bloom's taxonomy has anything to do with the emphasis on recognition type questions on workbooks including tests as opposed to recall? Like we have all multiple choice, so recognition of the word is in there and you're going to get it, but as opposed to recite for me.
That's an example of not ever going up the ladder, so to speak, of just, I mean, recognition is about as low or as easy a cognitive ability as you could get. I don't want to, I will just speak personally, professionally, not saying this is not a Patrick Henry College principle or anything. I think that speaks more to the inability of the tester or test writer to come up with a way to get to. It's awful easy to grade multiple choice, but not everything can be expressed multiple choice. And the higher, I don't want to touch that, I'm afraid to. The higher the level, the harder it is to grade it. That doesn't mean you should avoid it. As a matter of fact, that's the meat of it, what we want our students to be able to really be creative. And you can't say, well, it has to fit into this tiny little box, and that's the only thing that, you just undercut everything that we're trying to do. So
I think that may have come with the dumbing down.
This is a helpful insight. Where I teach, there are 40% international students in the high school level. And those international students come in with a great deal of knowledge. But our American students come in with very little knowledge.
but they're very confident about it.
Yes, and that's my next point. They believe that they know how to analyze and even be creative and synthesize new things, and so they're very confident, and they have a high self-esteem, if you will, regarding their abilities. Whereas if I give the international students an application or an analysis question, they're just befuddled. They've got no practice at it.
See, you need to get two of those, an international student and an American student together in a paired project, so that the one with the knowledge can support the one who knows how to think.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's the case. They believe that's the case.
Perhaps some of this might be some ways to say, okay, we're going to practice how, we're going to take some steps, and you're all going to, you got to be growing up. Impress me with your thinking. I know American students are so prone to judgment, but they don't understand that judgment is supposed to be related to discrimination of fact. They think judgment can be based on opinion.
Yes.
So, our future is at stake here, people. So, and anyway, use it, again, as I say, as a way to ratchet up the intensity and the rigor, and it kind of gives you some stepping stones, I would say, in instruction. So, thank you for coming, and if you have any questions, ask me anytime. I'll be around the rest of the conference.
Mrs. Veith, would you just put some of this in the hands of junior high students? If there's one of these tables or something to say, I mean, maybe to help them
Sure.
understand how you're, as a teacher, trying to pull them up that pyramid.
I wouldn't hesitate to do that, but I would do it as a lesson and teach them. I mean, I wouldn't bore them with all the Benjamin Bloom history notes, but just say, you need to know knowledge, and here's why.
But
You need to move up to comprehension to move up to here. How can you be making a judgment if you don't have the facts?
yeah, right. I just thought it would be a good teacher tool in the hands of a little bit older students.
Yeah.
To say, this is where I'm trying to, this is the goal I'm trying to help you get to, and usually.
I wouldn't hesitate to do that. And I did that, and then I might say, and now, by the way, solve the problem of pollution. And then, okay, what's the knowledge of pollution that you have? I give them something to apply it to, so they can say, wait a minute, you know what? Maybe judgment isn't as easy as I thought. Or something.
Thank you.
Remark like that.
Oh, I didn't show you these things, but see, if you want to buy things, you can get all sorts of neat little flip charts, and wheels, and all to help you with questions. Isn't that great? Questions, prompts, words.
Story, and then
Gail says I haven't done anything, but
But I think the way you get about the knowledge is, you have to invest in it.
right? You need more knowledge.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You mentioned earlier regarding zonal proximal development and so forth, and constructing basic. Can you expound more on what that means?
Okay, the zone of proximal development.
I'm getting to it in terms of how does that? Am I correct to say that doesn't connect with classical education, or it does? I guess.
It's kind of the zone of proximal development is scaffolding. Okay, so here's the student starting out, and here's the teacher. Now the teacher can perform whatever skill it is, and the student can't do it at all. So the teacher comes up with something here, and the student develops. But see, there's all this gap that the student learns can do this much, but still needs the teacher's help all the way here. All right, so the next activity we get to where, okay, let's learn up to this much. So now the student can do this much, needs less of the teacher's help, but still needs some. So what you're trying, the zone of proximal development is to move the student this way into the zone, so that the student needs less and less of the teacher's help, to where finally, look, the student can do the skills without any assistance from the teacher. So in adding 2-digit numbers, the first couple of times, it might be real easy work. Oh, so I should do that the other way. My saxopath is showing. Well, so when they get comfortable with ones that you don't have to carry, then you might start into ones that, oh my gosh, what do we do now? See, a student that can do this may not have this yet. And so you just take it step by step until they get to where, oh yeah, I can do this. The student gets the skill, but you haven't started them out expecting them to do this without doing the early. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Another prime example would be like leveled reading.
Yes.
Taking them, like a Title I teacher I was talking to,
Mhm.
and so she describes herself as a Vygotskian constructivist.
Yes.
And now that doesn't, am I correct to say it doesn't align with my classical? That's what the public school. That's
I know.
That's what they
I
say.
know.
The current research is saying is that you give them a little bit, and you in terms of reading development.
Yes. The problem is, the problem again to me with constructivism is knowledge exists before the student
Yes.
creates it,
Yes.
but they don't want to admit that.
Yes. I see. I'm on par with you. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So to make the child struggle to invent something that they want,
Yeah.
why not? Here, look, the alphabet.
Yeah.
You don't have to invent the alphabet to use it. You do need to learn it, but and I don't want to be unfair to the constructivists. I just think they're incomplete in their perspective. I think that yes, a student does have to internalize, and in that sense, a student, if I could say that a student has to fit knowledge into his own schema to make sense of it.
Right.
They call that constructing knowledge. I don't.
You call that?
I don't call it anything. I call it learning.
Yeah.
I mean, but I'm not saying that they are inventing, constructing knowledge. I'm saying that they're integrating it into their own schema.
Yeah.
But it existed before it was integrated into their schema, and
that's the part that's missed.
That I think constructivists will not don't deal with that. And of course, as a classical Christian educator,
Right.
they're not about to touch that.
Yeah.
God? No, God invented not. No.
Yeah.
So that's very frustrating. But I just don't think they have it complete enough for it to actually stand.
And you're saying Bloom's taxonomy is more complete? I mean, what?
No, I'm saying it's about the same.
Okay, that's what I brought. Okay, yeah, right.
Okay, in my classroom, I was very eclectic. I wasn't in the classical education school.
Okay, right.
Okay, and so an activity that some people might say, oh, that's a constructivist activity, I would still use it because in my mind it was...
you went up and down the taxonomy.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, right.
Yeah.
Right. So like for my kindergartner, asking them about their reading and how they would, using different parts of the taxonomy.
Mm-hmm.
And they're capable of that.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
I think constructivists don't understand how capable students can be, and so they keep concentrating on
where they're at,
the lowest levels, and let's not push them too hard. Let's not expect too much of them. Well, but again, that's a misapplication perhaps of constructivism as well. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not a constructivist, so.
Well, that's what my title when working with the kindergartner and starting in 5th grade, she still couldn't read, and so she started her at the lowest and brought up and said, hey, we've seen all this research, we've seen all this happen from, you know, hey, there's been so many kids improved and they went from this level all the way to X months later they could read, and I took that and I kind of digested it until kind of now I know exactly what you're saying, and I agree with you, and I what was I getting to? I lost my train.
But that has nothing to do with constructivism. So for your reading teacher to be saying, I'm a Vygotsky constructivist, that's nothing to do with what she just did with that child that got a 5th grader who couldn't read to read.
Yes. Yeah, I see what that's what, and you're saying that's just them learning.
Yeah, that's just them learning.
Yeah.
Somehow what she did finally clicked.
Yes. And so I don't know where I don't know what research they're looking at, but supposedly the basic construct, you know, taking them, and in X amount of, you know, after doing level books, they've gotten to this point on this grade level state standard of this strand. I mean, what...
So what if after a certain amount of time, they haven't gotten where they're supposed to be?
Like, when am I... Yes,
yeah.
Exactly.
So, I mean,
so
if
what
it,
do you do?
If it worked, if that constructivism worked, it would automatically, the time and the application would have been successful.
Yes.
But it isn't always successful.
It isn't. For example, my 5th grader who had an attitude and some psychological, whenever she took it from here to here, she shut down.
Yeah.
Because she was negative and didn't want to learn and thought it was too hard. So in that case, what do you know? It wasn't so. Do you look at so in my case, would I look at the taxonomy and take that student and go on and use this and pull out a verb and ask her to look at a different way? I mean, this taxonomy is all cognitive. The student you're describing to me has some affective concerns. Yeah, true.
So,
my
with that particular student, if I were dealing with her, I would find out whatever her interests are and provide her with reading material in her interest area, whatever it is, and then gradually get more difficult reading material in that area.
Right, okay.
So that her motivation is engaged.
Her attitude state, you know.
Yeah, her attitude needs some healing too. So, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I love talking to teachers.
Thank you. I appreciate the resources.
Sure. And how many years have you been teaching?
I just got done my first year.
Okay. Well, hang in there. Hang in there.
I gained so much this year, more than I learned in school.
What school did you go to?
I went to Missouri State Concordia St. Paul.
Oh, St. Paul.
Concordia
Yeah,
St. Paul. And they're a good school, but as in any state, they have, you know, that's progressive.
It is. And what's so funny is...
So I'm not a fan. I had a great time. But, you know, it's not ringing in my... And then teaching in a one-room schoolhouse and seeing and having kids analyze more than worry about how many points they got on how many... The last teacher I did was all about American history, and I had a world history unit and had them look at the timeline on the top of the room instead of worrying so much about what dates were what. I mean, did I have them not... I mean, am I saying that a timeline around the room and not memorizing dates is better or worse? I don't know. I'm still... But I had them look at it a different way. And so I can see this working, so...
I think I got this all turned off.
So,
very good. You hang in there.
Thanks.